have limited time. I'm just going to get right into it. I want to start with the crisis at the border. Recently, the Biden administration canceled asylum cooperation agreements and remain in Mexico. Since that time, we've seen a massive surge of migrants crossing and causing a crisis at our southern border. Why did the president rescind these agreements that were supported by our neighbors to the south?
Thank you. As a general matter, I really want to defer to my colleague, Ali Mayorkas at DHS to deal with questions on immigration. I would just say, with regard to those agreements, only one of them was actually in effect with Guatemala. You're correct that all three were rescinded. But the president is determined that we have a safe, orderly, and humane border. There's a lot of work that goes into making it such. It's going to take time to do that, and we very much look forward to working with Congress to try to achieve that, to have a rational asylum process, to have a refugee program that works once again to the best traditions of our country, and to make sure, again, that the border is safe, it is orderly, but it is also humane. But as I said, this takes time to do. In the meantime, we've also been very clear in saying to people, do not come to the United States now. Do not attempt irregular migration. You will not.
Well, my time is, I'll question the Secretary of Homeland Security next week, but yeah. The messaging has been a little mixed, and I think it appears to be, we're open. And I live in a border state. I was a federal prosecutor. When you send that message down there, they're going to come, and they are coming, and it has created a humanitarian crisis down there. We have so many children that we cannot even detain right now. So let me move on to Nord Stream 2. I recently sent you a letter requesting additional sanctions on the 15 entities reportedly working on Nord Stream 2 pipeline. As you know, these sanctions are mandatory. So my question is, and they're about 90% ready to complete this project, will you commit to submitting new sanctions on these 15 additional entities as soon as possible?
So on Nord Stream 2, a couple of things at the outset, just to be very, very clear. President Biden thinks it's a bad idea. He said so repeatedly. I share his view. It violates the European Union's own energy security principles. It jeopardizes the economic and strategic situation for Ukraine, for Poland as well. And so he opposes it. We oppose it. We'll continue to do so. I've been on the job, I think, 5 weeks. The pipeline is 95% complete. Construction started in 2018. So I wish we didn't find ourselves in the situation with a pipeline that's virtually complete.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think sanctioning these 15 entities would be great. On Iran, I think negotiations are always best from a position of strength. You know that as a diplomat. President Trump imposed a maximum pressure campaign that I believe gives us leverage as you go into these discussions. Sir, will you commit to me and to this committee that you will formally consult with us before lifting any sanctions on Iran?
Yeah, we're determined to consult on the takeoff, not on the landing, across the board. But yes, particularly when it comes to Iran, if there is any movement on this, and thus far there hasn't been, yes, we will do so. And by the way, not just Congress is the first stop, but also allies, partners, including allies and partners in the region who have their own concerns and own interests at stake.
Well, I think you have the leverage, and I wouldn't let up on it. I don't trust the Ayatollah. I don't know how you can possibly negotiate with the Ayatollah. I commend you for trying to, as we also try to negotiate with the Taliban. I think these are two most difficult organizations to negotiate with, and so I wish you the best, on that effort. It's a big challenge, as you know. On China, you've testified yourself that genocide is occurring in China, and I agree with you, and so does Congress, and so did the previous administration. We labeled it genocide. We put sanctions on individuals and entities responsible for these crimes against humanity. What additional steps are you prepared to take to stop this genocide?
A number of things, and I share that view. I share the deep concern about it. I think there are a number of things that we can do, should do, and will do. First of all, it's important to speak up and speak out. and to make sure that other countries are doing the same thing. The more China hears not just our opprobrium, but a chorus of opprobrium from around the world, the better the chance that we'll get some changes. We have a number of steps that we have taken or can take going forward to include, for those directly responsible for acts of genocide, gross human rights violations, sanctions, visa restrictions, etc. I think it would be very important if China claims that there is nothing going on, that it give access to the international community, to the United Nations. If they have nothing to hide, show it to us, show the world. And so we'll be calling for that. And then I think there are a series of practical things that are very, very important. For example, we should make sure that we are not exporting, and others are not exporting to China, any products that can be used for the repression of their people and their minorities. Similarly, we shouldn't be bringing into this country products that are created by forced labor, including from Xinjiang. So those are some of the practical things that we can and should do, but for sure we're going to start by speaking out forcefully on this.
Thank you, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Speaking of China, I was just running around and I just understand there was some breaking news that you and the National Security Advisor will be conducting an in-person meeting with the Chinese interlocutors next week in Anchorage. I welcome the news of that engagement. Can you tell us what you expect to be the agenda for those meetings and what you hope to have as outcomes of your engagement with the Chinese?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I'm heading off with Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin to visit two of our most important allies, Japan and South Korea. We leave on Sunday, and we'll spend the balance of the week there. On the way back, I'm stopping off in Alaska. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, will come out there as well, and we plan to meet with Director Yang Jiechi and State Councilor Wang Yi from China following that trip. It's pretty simple. This is an important opportunity for us to lay out in very frank terms the many concerns that we have with Beijing's actions and behavior that are challenging the security, the prosperity, and the values of the United States and our partners and allies. So we intend to raise, and we will raise, the host of issues, some of which have already been touched on today, that concern us. We'll also explore whether there are avenues for cooperation, and we'll talk about the competition that we have in China, with China, to make sure that the United States has a level playing field and that our companies and workers benefit from that. This is not a strategic dialogue. There's no intent at this point for a series of follow-on engagements. Those engagements, if they are to follow, really have to be based on the proposition that we're seeing tangible progress and tangible outcomes on the issues of concern to us with China. But this is an opportunity for us to put on the table.
Thank you for that.
Certainly we have, and to hear theirs.
Let me just ask you another quick question, limited time. You heard my opening statement, and I'm very concerned about diversity at the State Department. So I don't know whether you've done a review yet or not, but I'd like to ask you, what do you attribute to the disparity in promotions for racial and ethnic minorities? And beyond the establishment of a chief diversity officer, what do you plan on doing to address what many may call systemic discrimination at the State Department?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I share that concern, and I've said this on several occasions. I will consider it a mark of my success or not during my tenure as Secretary, whether we've been able to put in place a much more sustainable foundation for advancing true diversity at the State Department, to make sure that we have a foreign service and foreign policy workforce that looks like the country that it represents. And so, to your point, we will be appointing very soon the first Chief Diversity Officer and Inclusion Officer at the Department. That person will report directly to the Secretary of State. But beyond that, there is a significant, sustained effort that has to take place, not just on recruitment, although that's vitally important, but also on retention, to make sure that once people come through the doors at C Street and are working there, they feel welcome, they feel included, they're contributing, because if they don't, they won't stay. And there has to be accountability, starting with the Secretary of State. And so we're going to have transparency in what we're doing, including making available to Congress the different numbers and assessments of our efforts. Let me, one other quick thing on this. As you know very well, this effort has to start well before anyone gets through the doors at C Street. We have to be able to have in the pipeline that leads to people taking careers in foreign policy, in national security at the State Department, we have to be able to open people's imaginations and open their minds to the prospect that this would be a wonderful thing to do and a wonderful pursuit to which to dedicate their lives. And that means engaging in high schools, in colleges, across the board. I think you're going to see the State Department at all levels spending time in our own country to open people's minds to that prospect, and then finding ways to support them as they choose to make a career.
Let me thank you for that. And I'm also trying to make sure, I'm delighted to have you in. And as you may know, there's been some in the past. I don't want to focus on the past. We've got an oversight responsibility here on this committee. And to do that correctly, we need to have a constructive relationship with the department as Congress fulfills its constitutionally mandated oversight. So my quick question is, will you commit to have your staff begin those negotiations about document production to make sure that Congress has the information it needs to help restore American diplomacy?
Yes.
Thank you. And lastly, let me just ask you a quick question in regards to Afghanistan, because we know that ending the war in Afghanistan responsibly remains a key priority for many members of Congress and our constituents. So can you quickly explain to us the updated proposal and any feedback you have received from the Afghan government and the Taliban on this proposal?
The President's goal is very, very clear. It's to end the conflict, it's to bring our troops home, and it's to ensure that Afghanistan does not become a haven for terrorism and an ongoing threat to the United States. We're engaged in a diplomatic effort right now to try to drive the two parties to negotiate and to move forward on commitments that the Taliban made to the United States a year ago to negotiate meaningfully on a peaceful future for Afghanistan. Not only are we doing that, as important, we're enlisting other countries, the United Nations in that effort. Many of Afghanistan's neighbors have a real stake in its future and influence with the parties. So that diplomatic effort is ongoing. Meanwhile, we're reviewing our own troop posture, including the May 1st deadline. We haven't made any decisions yet about that, and we want to see where this effort goes to actually get the parties to engage in a meaningful way. The Taliban made other commitments when it comes to reducing violence, when it comes to not harboring or supporting terrorists. We want to see them make good on those obligations.
Thank you for that. My time has expired. And let me just say, I gave Mr. McCall and myself a little extra time, but for the rest of the members, I want you to know I'm going to be very strict on the 5-minute rule. The Secretary has graciously enough said he will stay as long as we can. So I would just ask you to, whatever you have, questions and answers within 5 minutes so that we can get as many members, if not every member, an opportunity to ask a question. I now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey and the ranking member on the Subcommittee of Africa, Global Health and Global Rights, Global Human Rights, Representative Chris Smith.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. For the past 40 years as a member of Congress, I've been deeply concerned about Chinese Communist Party's pervasive human rights abuses. In addition to several fact-finding trips to China, including to a concentration camp, I've chaired over 75 congressional hearings focused exclusively on CCP human rights violations, including pervasive religious freedom, persecution, torture, gulag labor, forced abortion, organ harvesting, democracy suppression, online censorship, the jailing of journalists and bloggers, and now genocide. Your predecessor, Secretary Pompeo, concluded that the persecution of the Uyghurs by Xi Jinping constituted a genocide, and there's no worse crime on the face of the earth. Last month at a town hall meeting, however, Anderson Cooper asked President Biden about China's treatment of the Uyghurs. The president gave a troubling response and said, quote, "Culturally, there are different norms that each country are expected to follow," close quote. An answer that was eerily reminiscent of President Obama's cultural norms defense of Chinese President Hu Jintao, which was roundly criticized by human rights defenders everywhere, including a January 19, 2011 editorial by the Washington Post called "President Obama Makes Hu Jintao Look Good on Rights." You did say again today, and you said in your Senate testimony, how you believe China was committing genocide, and Ned Price at State was asked whether or not it was ongoing, and I do believe you think it's ongoing, and I hope you would comment on that. and and whether or not a real cost for these crimes, these horrific crimes, would be imposed. Will you retain the entities list, for example? We have legislation that's pending that would make it a presumption against any product coming out of Xinjiang that it shouldn't come here because we can't determine whether or not its origin was by forced labor. In like manner, as the author of the House-passed Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, will you impose a serious cost on Xi Jinping and others for destroying Hong Kong's democracy, jailing great leaders like Joshua Wong, and conducting farcical show trials against some of the greatest human rights defenders on earth, like Martin Lee? Finally, Mr. Secretary, in 1984, I offered the first of several amendments that I've offered over many decades to condition population control funds away from organizations that support or co-manage coercive population programs. Now, as you have said today, and as we know from the executive order by the President, there was an order designed to resume foreign aid to organizations like the UN Population Fund that have been found repeatedly to be in violation of Kemp Caston's non-coercion policy. I'm especially concerned that as a senator, President Biden voted against a resolution in September of 2000 simply criticizing China's barbaric one-child-per-couple policy. And as vice president, he told students in China in 2011, and I went over to the floor and gave a speech on this, that he was empathetic and fully understood and wouldn't be second-guessing that cruel policy that crushes women. Also, because of China's limitation policy, tens of millions of girls are missing, dead, the girl child, simply because of being a girl, a female, because of sex selection abortion. I would hope we would stand with the oppressed. I have had hearings here with women, then I'll go to your answer, who have been forcibly aborted, got here through asylum, and they tell their stories. It's unbelievable how horrible, and that legacy, that trauma carries through in their lives for the rest of their lives. We should be standing with the oppressed against the oppressor. Yield.
Thank you, and I appreciate everything you've said. We are determined to put human rights and democracy back at the center of our foreign policy, to make sure that, as well, we have the tools that we need to be most effective in advancing human rights and democracy. One of the things I'm grateful for are some of the tools that Congress has given us to do that, including, for example, Global Magnitsky, which has been usually helpful in these efforts. But other authorities, sanctions authorities, and so on, to penalize those directly responsible for committing human rights abuses and other atrocities. As I was saying earlier, I think we have to start from the proposition that the most important first step is for us to speak up and speak out. And we are, and we will. And we also want to make sure that we're building coalitions of like-minded countries who share these deep concerns about human rights abuses in China or, for that matter, anywhere else. But then, to your point, to actually take action and apply the tools that we have to see if we can make a meaningful difference. We're committed.
The gentleman's time has expired.
To working with you to find ways to do it more effectively.
Thank you. The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere, Civilian Security, Migration, and International Economic Policy, Representative Albiol Series of New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Secretary Blinken, thank you for testifying today, and congratulations. As chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee, I look forward to working with you and your staff to deepen United States engagement in Latin America and the Caribbean. As you know, U.S. policy towards Cuba is deeply personal to me. I have firsthand experience of what it is to live under the Castro dictatorship. I came to this country when I was 11 years old. I still have memories of the military coming through, searching my house, accusing my father of hoarding merchandise. I have all these memories, and I have made it my priority when I came to Congress to promote democracy and human rights all over. But I've been encouraged by the statement that President Biden and the White House officials have made regarding the need to put democracy and human rights at the center of our policy towards Cuba. And as Secretary, I was wondering what steps could you take to promote political rights, civil liberties, and end its attacks on human rights defenders in Cuba?
I think across the board, we share the same goals when it comes to Cuba, and that is democracy and freedom for its people. I have particular respect for the views and the experiences of our fellow citizens who are Cuban American, because you not only know it, you've lived it, or your families have lived it. So this is something that resonates with me. We're looking at the entire policy right now, and we haven't come to any conclusions. I think knowing what the goals are, freedom and democracy for the people of Cuba, I think we also start with the recognition that obviously no policy in the past of whatever stripe has fully succeeded in achieving that. So we're going to be reviewing the policy. We want to do it in close consultation with Congress, and particularly with members who know these issues so well. As you've seen, there have been no early policy changes, and certainly we are not going to make any changes without fully consulting. So I look forward to the opportunity to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. You know, on January 1st, Congresswoman Norma Torres and I sent a letter to President Biden to prioritize the corruption and the protection of human rights, especially in Central America. I assume that we are also applying the same democracy and human rights to the region in Central America.
Yes, very much so.
Venezuela, as obviously is going to come up. I had a hearing on Venezuela the other day. I was very happy to see that the president designated the PTS to the Venezuelans, about 320,000 of them here in this country. I think that's the right step. They have suffered greatly. My concern with Venezuela is Russia seems to be more and more engaged with Venezuela. And I think they're trying to, well, I don't think, I know they're trying to destabilize the region. I spoke to the ambassador of Colombia. In 2019, Russia had 6,000 people go through Colombia, and they expelled 3 Russians. Now, for Russia, Colombia is not exactly a beach destination. So my concern is that they're using Venezuela to destabilize Colombia, to get involved in other elections in South America, and I would hope that the administration would focus on Russia's efforts to try to destabilize our neighbors in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, I share that concern. We see that in Venezuela. We've seen, I think, a resurgence of Russian presence and activity in Cuba the last few years, and we're very attentive to that across the board. And to the point you made a minute ago, too, I should just come back to it to say I think your emphasis on both spotlighting and combating corruption is absolutely essential, and this is something we're going to dedicate both more focus, more time, and more resources to, because we see it as both, unfortunately, prevalent in so many places, but also a little bit of an Achilles heel when we can put the spotlight on it, because when people see the corruption of their leaders, that's a good way to undermine support for said leaders.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, Central Asia, and Non-Proliferation, Representative Steve Shabbat from Ohio, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, you touched on the border with Mr. McCall, but it's such an important issue that I'd like to follow up on it. Now, obviously, border security is principally within the purview of the Department of Homeland Security, but there's clearly a foreign affairs aspect to the relationship between the United States and Mexico and the United States and Central America, and you're here. And what's happening now at our southern border is, in my view, a national disgrace. Now, it's always made sense to me that one answer to stemming the tide of the mass humanity fleeing places like Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador and Mexico is to help those countries improve the conditions there that cause the people to want to leave their own country in the first place. Fight the drug gangs that control neighborhoods and prey on people and target their children. Improve economic conditions. Reduce rampant governmental corruption. You and I probably agree on those things, and I know by the nodding of your head that we do. But this administration, unfortunately, policies toward our southern border since taking office a mere 7 weeks ago has, in my view, been feckless, incompetent. The Biden administration has a real mess on its hands, and it's a mess of its own making. This administration has essentially signaled to the world, come on in, our border's open, you can stay, and they're coming. Unaccompanied minors, way up. Single males, way up, many with COVID, and it's getting worse. Former detention centers are now called reception centers. The previous administration was criticized for allegedly holding kids in cages. Those photos, of course, turned out to be photos that had been taken during the Obama-Biden administration. But I'd argue the administration that you're part of is doing worse. Now, the previous administration, as Mr. McCall had mentioned, had skillfully reached agreements with Mexico and other countries to keep their migrants there, not here, pending the resolution of their immigration matters. As a result, illegal immigration into this country and the accompanying stress on the American taxpayers had much improved. Now, rather than requiring people to remain outside the U.S. while waiting for their immigration hearings, this administration has brought back catch and release. You're letting people into the U.S. and wait here for their hearings, even though you know that the vast majority of them are going to disappear into the interior of the U.S. and never show up for their hearings. This border crisis is real, and it's getting worse. Don't the American people deserve better than this?
So I would disagree with some of the factual predicates of your statement, but having said that, a couple of things. You're right, of course, that this is also a foreign policy challenge for the United States. Could not agree more. And in the early going, we've had intensive engagement with all of the countries in the Northern Triangle. I've spoken to all of my counterparts, and of course with Mexico, where President Biden has had a virtual visit, a virtual summit meeting with President Lopez Obrador. We had a similar engagement with my counterpart and other members of the government. We're working very closely with Mexico on what is a common challenge, including securing its own southern border, working to give people incentives also to stay in place and not come to the United States. To your point as well, where we very much agree, and I'd welcome an opportunity to work with you and other members of the committee, we have to deal with the drivers of migration, to your point. And I think there is real opportunity there to do that. When President Biden was vice president, as you may remember, he led an effort, very successful effort, a bipartisan effort with Congress to secure significantly more resources to help Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador deal with some of these drivers, whether it came to security, whether it came to corruption, whether it came to economic opportunity. And we did this in a way that was not simply throwing money at the problem, but demanding concrete reforms from these countries that actually materially improved the situation for people there and took away some of the incentives for them to come to the United States. We now have a proposal with additional resources over 4 years to do that, and to do that in a, I think, potentially effective way so that we can take some of those drivers away. So I'd really welcome an opportunity to talk to you about that, to work on that, and hopefully get support from Congress.
Thank you. I'm almost out of time, but I look forward to working with you. I've been a longtime member of this committee, and there's a lot of things we can work together on. Look forward to doing that.
Appreciate that.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I now acknowledge President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, Representative Jerry Connolly of Virginia, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for that title. It's so nice to welcome you here, Secretary Blinken. Let me just clear one thing up, though. In your very courteous answer to my good friend from Ohio, surely the absence of your contradicting the idea that there's a crisis in the border should not be construed as your consenting to the fact that there's a crisis at the border. Is there a crisis at the border?
We have at the border a lot of work to do to make sure that it is safe, orderly, and humane. We're engaged doing that work.
But, Mr. Secretary, the clear narrative that my friends on the other side of the aisle are trying to create is that only since President Biden took office has a crisis occurred on the border because of, I don't know, squishiness or unwillingness to really deal with the real problem. And I'm giving you the opportunity to clarify your thinking on that.
Well,
I, for one, don't acknowledge that suddenly a crisis materialized overnight on January 20th or 21st, but you're the Secretary of State.
I share that view, and as a diplomat, as I said to our colleague, I disagreed with some of the factual predicates of his question, and what I'm focused on is trying to make sure that from my vantage point and from the responsibilities I have, we are working as effectively as we can with Mexico, with the countries of the Northern Triangle, to deal with this problem together, because if we don't, we won't.
Right. And it's one thing to acknowledge there are problems. There have been problems for a long time at the border. It's quite another to manufacture a crisis for political partisan gain. Not that my friend would ever do that, but some might. Let me ask you, in the limited time I have wearing that NATO hat, you know, in talking to NATO allies from 30 countries and as well as associated countries, at least at the parliamentary level, frankly, enormous relief that there's a new administration in town that recognizes the importance of the transatlantic alliance. And certainly the President, as well as you, in your nomination hearing, have acknowledged that. Two things. How concretely can we move to try to reassure allies that we value the alliance and will absolutely commit to it? And secondly, what do we do about democratic resilience within the alliance? We see backsliding, and there are a number of us who believe that we actually have to have structures within NATO that advocate for those shared values we call democracy. Mr. Secretary.
I very much share that view, and first we have in President Biden, as you know, someone who believes strongly in NATO, in the alliance, the most successful alliance in history, and something that he sees as the glue that joins us to Europe. And so this is something, as you know, he spent a lot of time on himself in the past, and he is doing so now as well. I've been working the phones in the absence of being able to travel, although that's about to change, and I've engaged with virtually all of our NATO partners, or certainly many of them, and have heard the same thing that you're hearing, a thirst, a desire for the United States to be reengaged, and we are. I think you're exactly right, though, that we're seeing, unfortunately, more than unfortunately, tragically in some cases, democratic backsliding, not just in Europe, but indeed in many places around the world. Freedom House put out its annual report that continues to show that we're now on basically a 15-year democratic recession around the world. And the President believes very, very strongly that, one, we have to make sure that we're getting our own democratic house in order if we're going to lead by the power of our example. But two, we need to work with other democratic countries to strengthen their resilience. One thing that we're going to do, the President has talked about this, and we're working through it now. We will convene a summit of democracies, probably toward the end of the year, to bring together the democratic community, to look both at the challenges that we're each facing at home, and to see if we can learn some lessons from each other, because even though they're distinct and different, there are some common denominators. But second, to look at what the democratic agenda should be from challenges coming from the outside, and how we can work more effectively together to ward them off. But I would just say one thing in addition to this, because I really think it's important for a common responsibility for all of us. When we see democracy being challenged by China or by Russia, one of the things that they're trying to do constantly is not just to divide us from other democracies, but of course to divide us from ourselves, and in particular to try to make the case that the system that we all believe in and are dedicating our lives to professionally doesn't work, and that their systems are better.
The gentleman's time has
we can
expired.
demonstrate together that democracy actually delivers for our people and for other democracies. That is the single best answer and response to this effort by autocratic countries around the world to try to make the case that democracy doesn't deliver and autocracy does. So I hope we can work on that together, because that's the path to success.
The gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, Representative Joe Wilson of South Carolina, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. The International Criminal Court has taken actions leading to the unjustified prosecution of American and Israeli nationals, despite neither country being a member of the court. Most recently, the ICC issued a ruling that had jurisdiction to try Israelis for alleged war crimes in Palestine. I appreciate your statement opposing the recent moves by the ICC. What are the steps the State Department are taking to counter these recent actions, and how will you work to prevent ICC prosecutions of Americans or Israelis?
Thank you for the question. I appreciate it. We of course share the goal, the broad goal of accountability for international atrocity crimes. That's not the issue. In the case that you raise, as well as the attempt to assert jurisdiction over American troops in Afghanistan, we have strongly opposed those assertions of jurisdiction. It's been our view, it remains our view, that jurisdiction is reserved when a state consents to it, or if there's a referral by the United Nations Security Council. Neither is true in the case of Israel and the Palestinian matter that you just mentioned, nor is it true in the case of Afghanistan. We have the capacity ourselves to provide accountability when those issues arise. And so we will continue to make clear our opposition. I think the question for us, and it's an appropriate one, is how can we most effectively do that? And that's something that we're looking at right now. I think we've spoken out, we've been clear, and we'll see going forward how we can most effectively engage the ICC to avoid these assertions of jurisdiction when they're not warranted.
Well, thank you very much. On behalf of my constituents, also my youngest son served in Afghanistan, so I identify as a family member of the threats of the ICC, what they could mean to the American people. Additionally, in the past several months, we've truly seen historic efforts being made with Israel's relationship with their Arab neighbors. The UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan have joined Egypt and Jordan in establishing or moving toward full diplomatic relations with Israel, paving the way for peace through recognition and engagement rather than isolation and boycotts of Israel. How do you plan on strengthening the budding relationships between Israel and UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan? And are you going to encourage other Arab and Muslim nations to make peace with Israel?
The short answer to the second part of the question is yes, absolutely. And let me just say that we applaud the steps that have been taken toward normalization with Israel by a number of countries, including the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco. These are very important, and we want to build on them.
That's terrific, and because it's a dream come true to see the level of stability in the Middle East that many of us thought could never occur. Unfortunately, then we go to Nord Stream 2, and that is, do you agree that Nord Stream 2 pipeline is a Russian malign influence project, if completed, that would threaten European and U.S. security?
Yes, I think as we were discussing a little bit earlier, we oppose, the President opposes Nord Stream 2. He's been clear about this for some time. So have I. And unfortunately, the pipeline, as you know, is 95% complete. But we are making clear that we stand against its completion. We issued an initial report and sanctioned the leading pipe-laying ship, and we continue to review other possibilities for sanctions going forward.
And I appreciate you actually referenced the threat to Poland.
Mm-hmm.
What about a threat as already with the aggression in Ukraine?
Yeah. There too, and this is something that I worked on a lot when I was last in the Obama-Biden administration. We strongly stand against Russia's attempted annexation of Crimea. We stand strongly against its aggression in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, and we are strongly in support of Ukraine. We intend to strengthen that support, whether it's security, economic, or its efforts to strengthen its own democracy, which are vitally important, because one of the challenges, as you know, for Ukraine is it has to face aggression from the outside, from Russia, but it also has to deal on the inside with its own challenges, including the problem of corruption. We're determined to work on all of that.
Hey, another alternative would be Azerbaijan to Bulgaria, the Black Sea, with pipelines, and I urge you to make every effort on that. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the chair of the Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, and Global Counterterrorism, the representative from Florida, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the committee today. I want to first thank you for your statement yesterday on the 14th anniversary of the disappearance of my constituent, Bob Levinson. Thank you for speaking to the Levinson family. Bob deserves his final resting place to be here in this country that he loved so much with his beloved and remarkable family. I'm also appreciative of your commitment to implementing the Robert Levinson Hostage Recovery and Hostage Taking Accountability Act, and I look forward to working with you on that. There are at least 45 publicly known cases of Americans being held around the world. They deserve the full attention of our government, and as we deal with Iran, the return of Americans must be at the top of the list. Now, on Iran, you've been clear and were today with Mr. Sherman and your commitment to not get back in the JCPOA without Iranian compliance. You've also talked about the need to work with our allies to address making the deal stronger and longer, address some of the rapidly approaching sunsets, and tighten the inspections. There are some people, Mr. Secretary, who think we should get back in the JCPOA immediately, regardless of what the Iranians are doing. You are not one of them. There are also people who believe that we have to address everything, nuclear and non-nuclear, all of them, right at the start before returning to the deal. You've committed to building on the nuclear agreement to address the non-nuclear issues. We've got to find a path forward that can achieve all of our shared goals. You offered to sit down with Iran, as we talked about earlier. They said no and proceeded to begin using advanced centrifuges to enrich past JCPOA levels. The question is, can you lay out some thoughts on how to go forward, given Iran's refusal to engage? What do we do to build upon the JCPOA, lengthen and strengthen it, and address these other non-nuclear issues?
Thank you very much. First, if I could, just on the question of hostages, because this is something that I know you feel very strongly. It's something I feel very strongly too, and it is a priority for me to do everything I possibly can to bring home every American who is being held hostage or is otherwise being illegally detained in a foreign country, wherever that is. And one of the first things that I did, I think, on my first week on the job was to meet virtually with almost all of the families who have loved ones who are being illegally detained or held hostage abroad. As you noted, I had a chance to spend some time with the Levinson family this week. The Canadians have launched a really significant initiative, I think, that we should all try to work on together to build on, and that is to bring countries together to stand against the arbitrary detention of people for political purposes around the world. I would hope that over time, more and more countries will sign on to that proposition, and we will isolate the countries that continue to engage in these practices. With regard to the JCPOA, let me just say quickly a couple of things. First, we have to deal with the world as it is now. And the world as it is now is this. Whatever one's views of the agreement, and my own views are clear, but I know others disagree, but on its own terms, in terms of putting Iran's nuclear program in a box and cutting off its pathways to producing fissile material for a nuclear weapon on short order, it was succeeding. Our intelligence community said so, the international inspectors said so, and when we pulled out of the agreement, the Iranians then, of course, have a vote in this too, and have started to lift the constraints that were imposed on them by the agreement. As a result, we're now in a place where, under the agreement, the so-called breakout time, the amount of time it would take them to produce enough fissile material for one weapon, had been pushed past a year. Now, according to public reports, it's 3 to 4 months, and potentially getting shorter and shorter as, and if they continue to take steps to turn on aspects of their program that the JCPOA turned off. So I think we have an interest in getting Iran back into that nuclear box, because think of it this way. We have fundamental problems with Iran's actions across a whole series of things, whether it is support for terrorism, whether it's a ballistic missile program that's increasingly dangerous, whether it's destabilizing actions throughout the region. An Iran with a nuclear weapon or with the threshold capacity to have one is an Iran that's likely to act with even greater impunity when it comes to those things. So we have a real incentive to do that. So we've been clear that the best, most sustainable way to do that is through tough-minded diplomacy. We've made clear that we're prepared to re-engage in that diplomacy. There was an invitation from the European Union to all of the parties to the JCPOA, including Iran, including the United States, to come and start to talk about whether there was a way back to Iran meeting its obligations. We said we would attend. Iran so far has said no. I think the ball is in their court to see if they're serious about re-engaging or not.
Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.